Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So this is the training on the safety framework and using that to kind of inform your 30-day shelter care hearing reports and any other of your reports as well. This is going to be largely similar to the training that we do in our core training. So you're going to see the same outlets. For those of you that have been through the core training and know all of my little secrets about going through it, don't spoil it for the others, right? So just hang out and revel in the fact that you're watching learning in progress. So that said, how many of you are familiar with the ABA safety framework or have seen that or been a part of those presentations or kind of used it in your practice? Fantastic. Okay, so it looks about like half. So this is the training. We've been doing this. So I've been working with some partners at the court at AOC, the Administrative Office of the Courts. And so we have been trying to roll this safety framework training out for about a year now, probably a little bit longer than that, but just trying to incorporate it. It's based on a model by the American Bar Association. And I'll give you some links to that too. And I will say it's a little bit different than the way the department defines safety. Right? So we'll talk a little bit about those distinctions too as we go through this. And then finally, the reason I'm kind of excited about this training in particular is that I really want to give us time to practice using it and do some more thorough examples and really build out what a safety plan analysis or using the safety framework to kind of inform visitation recommendations and really build that out and really spend some time kind of playing with that. I feel like in the core training, it's just like, here's the information, throw something together really quick, and then we're going to move on to the next section. So we're going to do a deeper dive into that and really kind of analyze that, especially using the safety framework to make visitation recommendations between parents and kids. So hopefully that's what you thought you were going to get out of this, and we'll go ahead and get started. So just a reminder, parent-child reunification should always be the goal, absent clearly awful, horrible, and unchangeable circumstances, right? Especially during the first year or so of the case, right? Like our goal should be to reunify families as much as possible. That's why we're here and trying to figure out what the obstacles are to overcoming any parental deficiencies that the parents brought in with them to the case. Right? And really trying to hone in on that and really trying to figure out how can we get these children back to one or both parents. And just to set the context of this seminar a little bit more, I need you to keep in mind there is a huge difference between parenting or a parent being safe for 2 hours with their child versus parenting 24/7. When we first started doing these trainings, I had a 14-year-old kid. I fully trust that my 14-year-old kid and that any child that he brought with him to a visitation, a supervised one in particular, would survive, right? Like both of them would come out of that room alive, probably unsupervised too. Like the kid may cry, especially if it were a baby or something like that. My 14-year-old may not to do with it and maybe need a little help, but he could be safe, right? And that's the standard which we need to view visits between parents and kids. Can it be safely done? Because the other thing I need you to start thinking about when it comes to visits is not thinking of them as a parental reward for completing services. I need you all to think about visits from the kid's perspective. Everybody else is watching the parents and kind of that's how they're gauging what we should be doing with visits. The department, the courts, even attorneys, the parents themselves, they're all thinking about it, visits from their perspective, right? What they deserve, what they feel like they should earn. You guys are going to be the only ones who are thinking about it from the kid's perspective. And really thinking about what kids want. And I'm going to say, especially for younger kids, they want to be with their parents. And the standard by which we should be looking at when kids should be with their parents, or how much time a kid should be spending with their parents, should be how much of that can be done safely, not how far along they are in their services. Questions, thoughts, or comments or concerns about thinking about visits from the kid's perspective? Anyone?
I have a comment.
By all means, share.
So I have a child on my caseload who was removed from her mother's care because her mother severely abused her, severely. And yet she would always tell me that if I see my mother, I'm going to put my arms around her and tell her I love her anyway. And so she is now placed with some relatives and she's doing really well. But in the visit reports, the mom just went overboard. She was so loving and bought wonderful food and presents. And, you know, you would have thought that she was the best mom in the world if you did not know better.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, Kathy, that's a great point too. We'll talk about visitation notes as we go a little bit further on in this training, but thank you for bringing up that story and sharing that with everyone. Anyone else? All right, I guess it's too early in the morning for controversy, so we'll keep going. Okay. So as many of you know, part of some of the reason that we were driving these changes and kind of giving you this framework to use is there was a change in the visitation statute last year. So it's been almost a year. It was last July. So yeah, that this went into effect. And so the new standard is all visits are presumed to be unsupervised. That's what you're supposed to walk into, and that's the framework from which you're supposed to start, which is a shift in thinking of the way that we used to do it. Pretty much everyone did it in the past, which was start from supervised, the assumption that all visits should be supervised, and then figure out how we could make those visits unsupervised, right? So it's basically just asking you to shift things around, shift your thinking. So rather than starting from a presumption the visit should be supervised because the kids are here because of an unsafe situation, thinking about it from why do I need to add supervision to visitation? The other thing that changed with that too is that if visits were previously monitored supervised, these revert back to unsupervised at the next review hearing. So again, that presumption shifts back. If they were supervised, why should they continue to be supervised? You have to provide additional evidence. You just can't rely on the last court hearing and said, well, we'd already decided that. So there's a couple reasons why, and so I was working with the legislator that kind of put this legislation together, and there's a couple reasons why these changes occurred this way. That legislator, we had been working on this issue for years because part of the issue, I'll go ahead, Annette, before I start on my little story.
It says it's supposed to revert back to unsupervised. What if part of the thing is that the parent is supposed to take parenting courses because there were problems with the visitation or they didn't occur, so even if the parent did not take any of the parenting courses that they were supposed to take, they get unsupervised visitation?
You have got to dissuade yourself from the notion that services are tied to visitation.
Right.
Period. So the fact that the parents haven't completed services or anything like that has nothing to do with that child's ability to access their parents.
Okay.
Your question when it's coming to visits and how frequent and how often is how much can we do safely?
What if the visitations previously, when they were supervised, were not positive?
We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about how to kind of
Okay.
assess that. That's why we're here on that.
Okay, sorry, just jumped the gun.
You're good. You're good. So we were working with this legislator. The problem that she kept running into, she was looking at the bill that the state had for supervised visitations. And it was blowing her mind that we were spending millions and millions of dollars in the state on supervised visits. Because she would hear stories like, I had supervised visits with my child until the day before we were unified. And so what was happening is there was just this like, well, we'll just keep doing it this way, right? Nothing, no need to rock the boat. Everything's going well. We'll just keep doing it this way. And that's not what visits are supposed to be for, right? Visits are how we increase, just to put it bluntly, how you increase the parents' ability, put pressure on the parents to parent, right? As they are able to spend more time safely with their children, we should be cranking up the visits. Because ideally, we want to get them into a position where they're able to care for their child 24/7. You're never going to be able to assess that if you're just doing visits 2 days at 2 times per week for 2 hours. So the bill was a part of it too, but then there's just this, I agree, like we're paying for all, so the legislator too is thinking we're paying for all these services, we're putting all of these things in place to ensure child safety, and yet we're still paying for all these supervised visits. And we'll talk a little bit about why that may be a little bit later on the training, but that's kind of why this legislation was put in place. And it's basically like, hey, everyone, I need you to shift your thinking. Think about how these visits should be unsupervised. And then if you need to, give evidence as to why they should be supervised. Start with the presumption that they should be unsupervised. And if you need to, give evidence why they should be supervised. And we're going to talk about the language, about how to put that, how to do that safety analysis for yourselves in a language that the court is also familiar with as well. That's why we're here. Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning of the training, this is from this safety framework that we're going to be using is from the American Bar Association, and it's a guide for judges and attorneys. I highly encourage you. I will make sure that, actually this is already on our website, but when I post the video for these later this week, I'll make sure that I include a link to this child safety framework. Although it's written by an attorney, it's actually comprehensible. Like, it's not talking about all the legal mumbo jumbo and stuff like that. It's really just kind of laying out, here's how we assess safety, and here's how you, court, here's a framework for you to be able to assess safety as well. And like I was saying, so all the parents' attorneys, all of the court, all the judges, and now you all, this is the framework that we're using to analyze safety threats when it comes to children. And as I said before, the department is using a different framework, but it's very similar. And when we get to that point in the training, I'll explain how it's different. It's a very minor difference. All right, so let's talk about the child safety framework and what we're talking about. When thinking of child safety, that is an aspect of best interests, right? So on the right-hand side, you've got the best interest model. Best interest is comprised of safety, permanence, and well-being of the child. Those are the three domains that are in child best interests. We're going to be looking at just one of those domains, and it's the safety domain. And when we're really asking, when we're doing an analysis of safety, is it safe for that child? Is the situation safe? Is there any safety threat? Is it safe? The big difference between and then we've got safety planning, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So we're going to take that element of best interests and give you a tool and a framework in which to analyze that particular aspect of best interest advocacy. Additionally, on the right-hand side, you've got case planning issues, right? How do we do these things? How do we plan for the long term regarding safety, permanence, and well-being? Safety planning is very short term. Said another way, safety planning is an attempt to protect a child from harm by specifying threats and vulnerabilities and offsetting those by increasing protective factors. Safety planning is short-term, specific and narrow in scope, and generally non-transferable to other problems. It is a technical solution. We are just trying to prevent something bad from happening. Case planning, on the other hand, is an attempt to modify behaviors, build understanding, and requires an increase in self-efficacy and self-awareness of the parents. Case planning is generally long-term, generative, and broad in scope, and the knowledge gained can be transferable to other problems. It's an adaptive solution. We have a cliche in our language that tells you is very good, indicates the difference between these two ideas. Safety planning is giving a parent a fish. Case planning is teaching them how to fish. Do you understand what the difference there between those two? Safety planning is actually just trying to figure out how can we keep this kid safe. We're not going into the root cause. We're not trying to figure out why the kid can't be safe. It's just, can we keep this kid safe? Case planning is, why can't the parent keep the kid safe? It's asking the why. How can we fix that? That's the biggest difference between safety planning and case planning. Long-term, short-term, specific. For those, again, for that maybe more visual planning, here's the iceberg model when it comes to the difference between safety planning and case planning. Safety planning is just what's at the type of the iceberg. Okay, how do we keep the kids safe given these circumstances? Period. Case planning, again, is going deeper down. Okay, parent, are there patterns? Are there trends? Like, how do we know that why can't you keep the kid safe? Are there structures or things that are making it impossible for you to keep the kid in place? And how do we remove those? How do we get those out of your way? And then also, and probably most importantly, when it comes to case planning, what are the mental models that the parent is bringing into the situation? And as you know, the further down the iceberg you go, the more difficult and the more behavior changing that needs to happen. And that's hard. Safety planning, we can plan. Again, think of my 14-year-old. I can safety plan around my 14-year-old keeping a baby safe. Why he can't, and why he's in no capacity to parent, that's going way down deep in that iceberg. Y'all still with me? Okay. So we're going to talk about the three aspects of the child safety framework. They are threats, vulnerabilities, and missing protective capacities. So I like to think of this, for those of you this blue triangle. It's kind of like that fire safety stuff that we used to learn in grade school, right? You need in order to have a fire, the firefighters would all come in and do the training. And in order to have a fire, you have to have a spark, oxygen, and fuel source. It's the same idea with these safety threats. In order for something to be a safety threat to a child, it has to have these three components. What's the threat? How the child is vulnerable, and why can't the parents keep the kids safe? What's the missing protective capacity? So let's start with threats first, because that's kind of our first layer. And threats are specific and observable, out of our control, immediate or liable to happen soon, have severe consequences, and generally speaking, threats are everywhere. So let's use this rattlesnake as an example. Imagine you were walking down the side, you're walking down the path, not the sidewalk, but you were walking down a path, and you were walking there with like your 10-year-old kid, right? And you come across this rattlesnake. As a parent, protecting this 10-year-old, or let me put it this way. If you were an attorney or a judge walking down this path with your 10-year-old, this is the analysis that you would undergo. All right, I'm using my safety threat analysis. Is this snake specific and observable? Yep, it is right there in front of me. It's a very tangible thing. I can see it. Is it out of my control? I don't control what that snake is going to do. Is it immediate or liable to happen soon? I don't know that much about snakes, but I do know that that thing looks coiled and this little rattler thing is up. Something's going to happen. It is immediate or liable to happen soon. And there are severe consequences. Are there severe consequences? Yeah, if that snake bites me or that 10-year-old that I'm walking with, that's severe. And kind of where this analogy breaks down a little bit. Thankfully, snakes are not everywhere, especially rattlesnakes. But that is how we think of threats. Specific and observable, out of our control, immediate or liable to happen soon, severe consequences, and snakes are not, thankfully, everywhere, but threats are. Questions about how we diagnose a threat.
How do you, Ryan,
Mm-hmm.
How do you determine what's in your control and what's not in your control?
Do you control? So the question with that one is, I'm trying to think of an example. Are you especially when it comes to these things? I think it determines on whether or not it's an external factor, right? Internally, you can control yourself, but there are things out in the world that you can't. And so those things out, it has an external characteristic to it, meaning that you are not able to physically control that thing. You do not control that thing, that act of nature, or whatever is happening. And that's just part of that threat analysis. But there's an external component to it. It's my way of thinking about that one.
I struggle with that because the control could also stem from a mental health issue.
That's where we get into protective capacity.
Okay. Thank you.
And even then, Martha, even if with the parent that does have a mental health capacity issue, that may or may not be in their control. Do you see what I'm saying? Like that's beyond their control. There are ways that we can mitigate that, obviously, medicine, therapy, those sorts of things. But that the threat itself may be a mental health issue that is out of our control at the time.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Uh-huh. Okay, those are threats. Let's talk about the second leg of the triangle, vulnerabilities. This one's pretty easy too. Vulnerabilities are child specific. What a child, a threat may be a threat, or a child may be vulnerable to a threat. So a 3-month-old may have different vulnerability than a 16-year-old when talking about a threat. Right? Because of that 3-month-old, like they're almost completely dependent on somebody providing parental care to them. A 16-year-old, not so much. So you can have a threat. So you can have like a sibling group, right? Where you've got some of the kids being exposed to the same threat or something posing a threat that some of the kids are vulnerable to and some of them aren't. That's legit. There's no such thing as universal threats. I say that and now I can think of about 8 different examples in my head. So, but generally, so when you're looking at is a threat, you've got to take it to the kid level. How is that kid that you're talking about vulnerable to that specific threat? And they either are or are not. Vulnerability is not judged in degrees, meaning you don't say a kid is a little vulnerable or very vulnerable. They either are vulnerable or not. And when you're on the fence or you're not sure, go ahead and presume that the child is vulnerable. So child specific, it's binary. They either are or they aren't. And if there is a threat and you're not sure, presume that the child is vulnerable to that threat. Questions about vulnerability? Okay. Protective capacity. All right, let me go to the chat here. I understand parents' participation in services does not affect their access to visitation with their child, but if a parent is not participating in court-ordered UAs and sobriety was a factor at the start of the case, would a lack of UAs and confirmed sobriety mean the visit should be supervised? Hold that thought, Stacy. And I'm going to ask you later on to run that example through this analysis. All right, so let's talk about missing protective capacities. So protective capacities are displayed by the caregiver and we put them into 3 buckets. That's just to help us kind of sort them out and analyze them. Nobody's ever going to ask you, is that a cognitive or behavioral missing parental capacity? No, it's just to help us, give us a little bit more of a framework. But these are the 3 buckets or 3 categories of missing parental capacity, protective capacity that we generally find. The first one being cognitive, meaning that they know, do they know that they're responsible? Behavioral, can they physically do the act of being able to protect the child? And then emotional. Do they want to? Do they know they should and that it's their responsibility? Can they physically do it? And do they want to? All right, so the first, cognitive capacity. Cognitive protective capacity refers to specific knowledge, understanding, and perceptions that contribute to protective vigilance. This aspect has to do with the caregiver's recognition and awareness that, one, they are the parent or they are performing the parental role or their caregiving role. They understand that that's their role and that's their responsibility. Two, that they're the ones responsible for keeping this kid safe. Three, they have to be on the lookout for danger. And four, they know and recognize cues that alert them that danger is impending. Can anyone think of examples where a parent may be lacking cognitive capacity to safely care for a child?
Yes, Ryan, this is Janet. Yes, I have a case right now. The mom is probably about 20 years old, but her cognitive capacity is like a toddler. She is mental retarded. And they have visits, they are supervised. And so many times the mom treats the baby like a toddler would a baby doll.
Yeah. So developmental delays, that's a long-term cognitive capacity. That's a great example of when we have parents that may be missing that cognitive capacity in the long term. Other examples. Oh, Jennifer kind of got it in the answer in the chat. Being high. That's the easy one, right? Drunk, high. At the time that they're being asked to provide that care, that protective care. It's short term. But if they're high enough to not be able to know and recognize cues that alert them that danger is impending, that's a missing protective capacity. So cognitive capacity is the first one. The next one, and you will find as we go through these, that these buckets are, they're buckets, but then they're all kind of tied together at the end. So there's a little bit of overlap in some of these. Doesn't matter. It's just to kind of give you some examples of what there are, how parents may be missing the protective capacity they need to keep their kids safe. This is a good example. Behavioral protective capacity refers to a specific action, activity, and performance that is consistent with and results in parenting and protective vigilance. So while cognitive contemplates knowing, behavioral capacity contemplates the parent's ability to perform an action. So they have to be able to they have to have the physical ability to act in ways to protect. They have to have the ability and willingness to stop what they want to do, basically defer what they want to do, in order to meet the child's basic needs, keeping that kid safe. They also have to have the energy to do what they need to do, the energy to provide that care. And then finally, the skills that will help them effectively carry out what he or she intends. Can anyone think of behavioral capacities that a parent may have missing behavioral capacity, their inability to act? Being too drunk or high to get out of bed, that's a good one. Mary?
Under threat of domestic violence, one partner won't allow the other partner to do what they're supposed to.
Yeah, that's a great example too. Denial that there is a problem.
Significant physical disability.
Yeah, right. They physically can't do it. They can't get out of bed. Regardless of not whether or not they're high or drunk, they just can't do it. Mary, did you have another one?
Nope.
Okay, sorry. There you go. Liz, this is a good one. Non-medicated depression. I think one of the big ones that I think about here too is like postpartum depression, right? Those parents mom knows that she's supposed to be taking care of her kid. She cognitively understands that. She just can't do it. Like she can't get out of bed. Another one too, especially for this last one, skills that will help the caregiver effectively carry out what he or she intends. A good one for that example may be something like if the child has a feeding tube, like a GI tube, and the parent doesn't have the skill or know how to properly maintain that tube. So they can be with that child in small amounts of time, right? Where they don't have to worry about where the GI tube isn't necessarily an issue, but they cannot stay with that kid long term, or maybe not even be safe enough for them, depending on the severity and how old the child is, those sorts of things, to not be with that child without somebody being there who understands how to use that feeding tube. The last one is the emotional capacity. And emotional protective capacity involves the feelings, attitude, identification with the child, and motivation. That results in parenting and protective vigilance. There are two critical issues that influence the strength of emotional protective capacity. The first one is the nature of the attachment between the caregiver and the child. I desperately need to change this slide. It's not about trying to figure out whether or not the child and the parent are attached or bonded. That's not what we're talking about. That's not the level that we're talking about here. What we are talking about is whether or not that parent, regardless of whether or not they're related to that child, but that parent has the emotional ability to want to keep a child safe. Not how well they're bonded or how well they get along or that sort of a thing. It's just, does that parent understand and want to keep a child safe from harm? The other one is the caregiver's own emotional strength. If a parent is so wound up or so spun up about an issue, right, that issue is completely overwhelming them, whatever it may be, they are more concerned about what is happening to them rather than what is going on with their child. That's that missing emotional capacity piece that we're talking about. And again, that might be a temporary situation. You know, you can think of examples where like a parent just got some really weird or disturbing news right before they're about to do a visit. And they're all like wound up about what that is and what that means. They may not be able to be they may not have the emotional capacity to take care of a child at that point. They're more concerned about what's happening to them than keeping their kids safe. And that might be fine in a day or two. But having that emotional capacity piece at the time of the visit. In summary, What are the threats? Is the child vulnerable to this threat? And are there protective capacities that we can put in place to mitigate or reduce the threat and keep the kids safe? Does anyone have any questions about, I guess we kind of skipped over the missing parental capacity piece. Does anyone have any questions about any of the components of the triangle thus far? Or want to go back and review something? So you guys are all experts? Okay. Well, so there we go. We were in, oh, skip over that. So in summary, it is safe if there are no threats. If there are threats, the child is not vulnerable to those threats. Or if there's sufficient protective capacity, if there are threats to which the child is vulnerable, or if there's stuff that we can put in place to keep the kids safe. It's not safe if there are threats that exist to which the child is vulnerable and the parents have insufficient protective capacity to control those threats. Is that a question, or are you just applauding me, Martha? I'll take either.
How about where you take both?
Yes.
So what happens in regards to the visitation child safety framework if there's an older child, like a teenager, who is very angry at a parent, and the parent, you're not sure whether or not they're invested in going forward with the case? And so there's a potential for significant animosity, if not more physical. But is it just you're evaluating the parent's ability or the parent figure ability, whereas it's possible that it's not safe for the parent?
Yeah, that's a great example too. And so that might, I've never heard of that situation, but the same rules would apply. Like if the parent can't keep themselves safe, or meaning they can't effectively parent the child, then yeah, the safety threat is that the kid poses to the parent for the purposes of visits. There's case planning issues there. There's a lot of underlying case planning issues there, Martha.
Yes.
But in terms of like, can the parent and the child safely coexist in the same space to be together? Yeah, you can have that, the reverse be true as well, especially when you're dealing with older kids.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we were playing around in theory land. Now we're going to put you guys to the test. Since none of you had any questions, you should be able to answer all of these very easily. But okay, to the left, you are going to see, you do see an electrical outlet. This is a standard electrical outlet that hangs out around 18 inches above the floor, 120 volts, standard amperage. Do I have any electricians in the room? I do this during our core training, and it's the electricians in the room that they have so many questions about this particular electrical outlet. It is your standard household electrical outlet. It's not connected. It's not GFCI. It's just your basic standard electrical outlet hanging out about 18 inches above the ground. What I want you to do, using this new framework that we just used, is determine whether or not this is a threat to these 4 children. And so the 3-month-old is just a baby, 3-month-old, a 3-year-old. And I know this is kind of going outside of, we say, very specific to each child, but I just need you to kind of practice this, use what you know about kids at these various ages. A 7-year-old, Chris, in our character story, he's, typical rambunctious 7-year-old, runs around, a little bit crazy, but he's 7. And then a 15-year-old. Is it a threat? Is the child vulnerable to the threat? And you can discuss this, but it's not vital. Ways that we could keep that kid safe from that threat if you determine that it is a threat. I'm going to break you up into small groups to have some small group discussions about this. And when you come back, I want you to answer, be able to answer, is it a threat? Is the child vulnerable? And what can we put in place to keep the kids safe? And now that I have announced that we will be going into breakout rooms, there is the mass exodus of folks who don't want to participate in breakout rooms. But okay, what questions do you have about what I'm going to ask you to do? Or clarifications needed on the scenario? Don't forget, those of you who have been through the training, be quiet. Okay. All right, I will see you back here in about, let's do 10 minutes. Happy discussions, everyone. All right, everybody, welcome back. So let's start with the 3-month-old. Is this electrical outlet a threat to the 3-month-old? What say you?
So Ryan, our group initially said no, because can't really walk around and put your little fingers in like we would think. However, literally the last second, as you were pulling us back into this group, somebody indicated if the crib was placed in such a way that little fingers could get out and reach it, then yes, it could be.
You guys are jumping ahead. That's not the answer I want.
That's not the answer you want? Okay, nope. Never mind. Bye.
Close though. Is this a threat to the 3-month-old? Why is everyone shaking their head no?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Jennifer. Those of you who said no, how is it a threat?
Well, it's a threat to everyone, right? Potentially, like a rattlesnake would be.
Okay.
It's a generalized threat. But is the 3-month-old vulnerable to it?
Leah, you're shaking your head yes about vulnerability.
Well, Ryan, I have both in my head, right? So, because I was trained on the departments. So I always get it confused. So I don't think it's a threat, because unless another person like threw some water at it, right? Like, I don't think the kiddo is a threat to it, but I think the kiddo could be vulnerable to it. But if a 3-year-old is sitting in the middle of a room, 3-month-old, usually a 3-month-old is not moving. They're not like going anywhere. So unless someone, so.
I got you, Leah. Okay.
Yeah.
But what you're describing, if I'm just going to pick on you because you've been through this a couple of times, but what you're describing is why the 3-month-old isn't vulnerable, because they're not mobile, right? So it's a threat, right? Is that electrical outlet a threat to you?
It could be.
Yeah, it could kill you. It's a threat. It's specific and observable. You don't control electricity. And if you did, then that would make you a superhero and you don't need to be doing this job. It's specific and observable, severe consequences. It meets all the criteria of a threat.
No, and I know the answer because I've been through this a few times. It's still hard when according to the department, it's not a threat.
So.
No, that's what I'm saying. I don't want to confuse anyone on this platform. So that's why I think my head always goes like I come every single time because I'm trying to learn both of them in my mind, because we have to use the language of the department in the courtroom, because that's what the courts, well, in Pierce County, they generally use. So, but I think it's important for me to know both but yeah, that's where I get.
So let me talk to you. So exactly. So what Leah was saying about the difference between the two models, the department's model incorporates vulnerability into the threat analysis. They do not separate those two out. This model does. So the first thing that we have to analyze is, first thing you ask is this a threat? Does it meet the criteria of, sorry, let me go back. There we go. Specific and observable. Yes, that is a very specific and observable electrical outlet. Is it out of our control? Do not control electricity? Yes. Is it immediate or liable to happen soon? If it's alive, yes. Are there severe consequences? Yes. Right? So that's that analysis. Is this a threat? Yes. Are each of those children vulnerable? 3-month-old? Probably not. Because they're not mobile. A 3-year-old? Hell yeah. Right? That's why we have all those electrical outlet things. A 7-year-old? Yup. And a 15-year-old, depending on which TikTok videos they've watched recently, potentially. Just like you're vulnerable to that. Or that is a threat to you, but because you know about electricity and you know how to keep yourself safe, you're not vulnerable to that in everyday life. Got it? We'll talk about the department's model a little bit at the end. I'll just go over those safety threats. But again, all you have to remember with them is that they just combine threat and vulnerability as one layer of analysis. We tease those out separately. You ready for another one? Here we go. The liquor shelf. And I'm using the word shelf intentionally. No, it does not have doors. It sits about 4 feet off the ground. 4.5, 5 feet. Yes, there are liquor in those bottles, even though there's no recognizable brands there. Yeah, it's sitting there. The glasses are bottles, or the bottles are glass. The glasses are bottles. The bottles are glass. What other questions do you have about this scenario?
Ryan?
Yes, Kathy.
One of my first cases had this exact same thing in the home. And it was two relatives that were going to adopt this little 3-year-old. And so they had a baby gate up around their wood stove. And they had a baby gate up between the living room and the kitchen. But just as you walk into the house, right there in front of you is this liquor cabinet, just exactly like this. And it's not close to the ground. It's probably like 4 feet off the ground. But so I made a big deal of it, and I was told that was not a threat because
save it for your group. Save it for your group.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Nope. We're going to go into small groups again.
Okay.
Same thing. Got it. And do you guys? Well, I think it's too late. I mixed up the groups, so you're going to have different people that you talk to this time around. All right. See you in a little bit.
I didn't mean to mess it up.
Welcome back, everyone. So who would like to discuss this liquor shelf? Let's start with the 3-month-old again. Is it a threat? What do you guys decide?
Yes.
Say more, Stacy, than yes. Why is it a threat?
Well, after the last example, I feel like almost anything can qualify as a threat, really. So, this is a threat, obviously, for the glass. If the baby were to reach over and it could fall on them, or but yeah, I mean, or I don't think that they'll accidentally ingest it, but maybe just even for the glass risk or the heaviness of the bottle falling, or.
Sure. So what would happen? What would have to happen for that situation as you describe to actually be a threat for the child?
Well, I mean, I think that, if they have their extra saucer or their bouncer or swing near that cabinet, but also you could have an earthquake because we do live in Washington, or I don't know. I'm just thinking of like literally anything. I think it could pose a threat in any of those situations.
Oh, Stacy, my heart just soared at that answer. I
That's-
love the earthquake. Yes, you're right. So, and wrong.
That's okay. I can handle it.
No, that's okay. So, in order for this to be a threat, particularly for the 3-month-old, there has to be a couple of circumstances that put that kid in danger, right? Like, so what I often hear, and I think I'm pretty close to training 1,000 people on this safety model. But what I often hear is, well, what if the child's crib or bassinet was placed under that shelf? And what if then there were an earthquake? Or what if the 7-year-old moved a table and chair over there? And there's all these what ifs. Here's the other thing I need you all to consider when you're doing safety threat analysis. And that is the dreaded what if monster. Meaning that, and so the rule of thumb, this is not a hard and fast rule, but this is just a rule of thumb, is you only get one what if. If you have to put more than one what if together to make something a safety threat, I highly encourage you to re-examine whether or not that's a threat. So, for example, we were just talking about the 3-month-old, right? And it was, what if the child's bassinet or baby crib was placed right under that shelf? That's one. Okay. And then what if there were an earthquake? A little more challenging. So that's that basic kind of analysis there. So, and when it comes to this, so obviously, what about a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old would you guys come up with in terms of a threat? Anyone?
Well, the threat would be if they took them out and broke glass. I gave an example of when my first job, I worked at a Safeway boxing groceries in a state where they had liquor all over the store. And there was probably a 4-year-old, and he ran into a big display of vodka bottles, and they went everywhere, and glass and vodka were everywhere, and I had to like reach over and pick that kid up to get him out of there. So to me, that is the threat, is the falling of the bottles, more than ingesting them.
Yeah, so it doesn't, and this is one of those things too, where it could be, you could convince me either way whether this was a safety threat, depending on the kid, depending on the circumstances, right? Because it doesn't matter to that point. What if these were just glass? What if these were flowers in a vase? Would you still have that same concern?
They were up high enough and the kid could reach them and pull them over on themselves. It was like those big Waterford vases or something. Anything that the toddler could potentially pull down and smack themselves with is a threat, right?
Yeah, if you've got a climber, yeah. So sorry, yes, it could be a threat, absolutely. But maybe you have a kid that they don't climb things, like they would never do that. Totally safe. That's where that vulnerability piece starts to creep in or starts to apply as well. So yeah, you could say I could go either way, whether this was a threat or not. The key piece is going to be the vulnerability there, right? And that's the thing with these safety threats. They're not always right or wrong answers, right? That's what I need you. But you have to be able to show your work, right? Tell us how you got there. Explain it. That's the whole point of this, right? It's not just, yes, I think that is. It's how did I get there? What's my rationale? What's my reasoning? so that the court can follow it. Yay, I get an award because I just tied the theme of the conference into the presentation that I gave. But that's easy for me. Okay. Do you want to do one that's a little bit more complicated? Good, because I haven't. So there's the what if monster. You get one what if. If you got two, you need to rethink that. Because that's the other thing that happens with safety planning too, is your mind goes into the danger zone, right? Like, and it's really easy to start thinking about how something could be a threat rather than it by being realistic about the appraisal of the safety. So just be cautious of that. All right. So with this example, I'm actually going to give you a tool or a worksheet to use for this so that it's a little bit easier for you. And so this is the, put it in chat here. Everyone. This is kind of all of the stuff that you've just learned about on that piece of paper, all in one spot to kind of help you with your analysis and think things through. But so the situation that we're going to be talking about, I want you guys to do in small groups, is you are about to, so it's a Saturday morning, you are about to go observe a visit between a mom and her 4 children, the 3-month-old, the 7-month-old, or the 7-year-old, the 3-year-old, and the 15-year-old. On your way into the facility to observe the visit, you happen, mom comes in at the same time. You guys are walking in together, and she lets you know that on Wednesday she slipped up and used meth. She was out with some friends. She went home with them after the bar, and like she used meth on Wednesday evening. It's now Saturday. And my question to you all is this a safety threat for mom and the kids? And I'm going to give you some time in your small groups to think about this one. And then we'll come back and discuss questions that you have about the scenario.
Is Wednesday really the last time that she did meth?
Don't know.
Okay.
Are there any special needs?
Nope. Just a 3-month-old. Stacy, to answer your question, she drove there. You guys are walking in okay. She seems normal. She does not seem intoxicated, if that helps. Yep. Welcome back, everyone. Is it a threat? Anyone?
I would say no.
I got a no. Anyone say yes? No one said yes. All right, Martha, why is it a no?
Well, the criteria is specific, observable, out of control, immediate or liable to happen soon, and severe consequences. And based upon the information provided, it doesn't meet all that criteria.
Yeah, specifically timely, right?
And there's nothing observable.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone disagree or have thoughts or concerns?
I do have one question.
Uh-huh.
This is a 3-month-old?
Yes.
So is this mom nursing? I mean, I guess that could be the only threat. Just thought of that.
Yeah.
If they're having a lot of visits, that's the only way I really see it as a threat.
Point taken. Absolutely. Right. Because that means the child would be vulnerable to that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But this is Ann Carr, and it seems like they're out of the home at this point. So I don't know how that could be, breastfeeding could be an option.
Well, sometimes they do that. Yeah. They'll have multiple, short visits over the week or something like that in order to facilitate breastfeeding.
I think it would depend on the emotions of the parent when they come into that visit. If they're agitated and have severe symptoms of withdrawal, and they're angry and out of control with their emotions, then yes, it's a risk. But if they're calm and in the moment have control, then it wouldn't be a risk. But it would really depend on how that parent is acting during that first 15 minutes of the visit. You'd have to assess that.
Sure. The other thing that we have here too is the short-term offset, right? We've mitigated against that potential risk because it's a supervised visit, right? So in that circumstance, there's a whole bunch, we've got safety. We've mitigated the parents' ability, even if they were agitated, right? You have somebody there doing line of sight supervision. Or even if they showed up for the first 10 minutes, like you're talking, Mary, maybe it's just monitored, but the monitored piece was just make sure mom isn't high before she, too wound up before she goes, but otherwise it's okay.
Ryan, I was going to say something about the nursing part. The
Yeah.
nursing part gets really, really tricky.
Uh-huh.
I've had lots of parents who nurse while their kiddos out of home, who pumped and stored the milk, and they gave the milk. And I've had parents who nursed when we knew they were using, and it gets tricky because it's their parenting right in a sense. So I've had it to where we actually had to go to court about it. So it's not, it just gets tricky because that's their parenting right. And if we suspect that they are, a lot of times they're not going to be truthful. So it's great that she was truthful. This is one of those great moms who's holding herself accountable, but a lot of times we don't know. So I've had times where I've suspected, but they wouldn't UA, but I couldn't tell them they couldn't breastfeed their kiddo. So it does become a tricky one. And I just feel like, either you advocate for it to be in the court order that, like if you truly find that, but it's not something we can really say to the parent. Even when I worked for DCYF, that was a really fine line. So I just know someone brought that up. So just be careful of how you approach that, because that is kind of something, it could be a cultural thing that's it's a lot goes to play in that.
Yeah, but in that circumstance, Leah, it's because we're here for the child, right? Mm-hmm. We have the ability to go and maybe consult a medical professional and say, with this drug, what's the chance of that being passed on through the breast milk, right? We're trying to identify what the threat actually is.
Yeah.
Right. And then being able to provide that information to the court and say, here's the medical information. Here's why this is a safety threat. Obviously, the child is vulnerable because they're breastfeeding. And, what are ways that why is that? So again, the missing parental protective capacity is that she's using and passing on the drug potentially to the child. And we don't know if she's using or not.
No, that's why I said advocating that to the court. I don't think I would talk to a parent in that about that. And I definitely think, so I'm saying this, Ryan, because I had an advocate who did this on my case, and then the attorney was like, no communication, because it was so, and that's kind of why I'm just like saying it could be a slip. Yeah, I'm just learning experience is that, yeah, I think I would advocate for that in the courtroom, but having that discussion with the parent, because it's like, oh, we're accusing them of using drugs, right? So it could become a slippery slope. So that's what I meant by it. I wouldn't personally, I would do my, like you said, research and things like that, talk to the medical provider, but I wouldn't per se have that conversation with the parent, because, you know, also we have to understand we are a legal party, and that could be looked at a certain way. So that's what I was getting at. Absolutely.
So as a child advocate, when you go do your next report to the court, aren't you going to say that? So I told my group, first thing I would do afterwards, after the visit, which I didn't think there was an immediate threat in the visit, as mitigation, I would talk to my supervisor and say, I'm going to have to report this, right? And what is my stance, because I'm for the child, on this incident?
So that's why we have the category of long-term solutions on that worksheet, right? So in the immediate, how do we keep that kid safe in the immediate? You already identified, nothing, there's nothing that's going to cause potential harm here, right? So it's not an immediate safety threat. But does this have long-term implications? Oh my gosh, yes, totally. Like, that's why mom's here in the first place, because she was using, right? And she's having trouble overcoming her addiction. So that's that case planning piece that we're talking about, right? Like, mom needs to go to rehab, or whatever, mom needs to let her sponsor, whatever the protocol is for mom's relapse or beginning to use again. But that's that case planning solution. One of the problems that we've experienced with advocates in particular with this model is that there was this like, well, okay, it's not a safety threat, but what do I do with this information, right? Like, it's still a problem. It's just not an immediate problem. So that's why we added this fifth column, that column off to the side that has what are the long-term implications of this. So it may not be an immediate safety threat, like use of a drug, unless the parent is actually showing up high and trying to interact with the kids. That's a safety threat, depending on the severity and the vulnerability of the kids and all that. But regardless, if that's the issue that brought the parent in, they've got to get that habit under control. That's the long-term case planning solution. So remember, I think I actually talked about it again. It's the iceberg, right? Safety planning is up here. So in this circumstance, under this last scenario, mom wasn't high, mom was okay, we're good. And you could probably, and those of you who've been around enough, like, no, it's not, being high is not either or. There are degrees of highness, right? So sometimes you got parents that show up and they're high, but they're still safe. That's cool. But like you're saying, if they're like whacked out on meth or coming down or just like crazy, or if their drug of choice is heroin, like, right, and they're falling asleep with a 3-month-old, that's a problem, right? But I would argue, even, let's say you got an 8-year-old and it's a supervised visit and mom or dad falls asleep because they're addicted to heroin, they fall asleep in the visit. Not a safety threat, right? Case planning issue, definitely, but not a safety threat, especially if it's supervised. Now, if it's unsupervised, 8-year-old, right? But that's what we're talking about, the ability to separate safety planning versus case planning. Other questions? All right. So, sorry, that example in this example with the meth, for you seasoned volunteers, that should be a no-brainer. Oh my gosh, they only used on Wednesday. Amen. That's awesome. They used 5 minutes before they did the visit. All right, that's a different story, potentially. All right. I do have a list of some here are some things that are not safety threats. And when I say something is not a safety threat, I do not mean it's not a problem. I'm saying in terms of the analysis between a case planning issue or a safety threat, these are not safety threats. Number one, parent showing up late for a visit. It's not a safety threat. That child is not in harm. Right? It's annoying. But another way to think of safety threats too, this might be a little bit extreme, but just to kind of give you that idea, do I need to call 911? Am I that concerned? So parent showing up late for a visit, not a safety threat. Parent missing a visit, not a safety threat, right? This is a big one for you all, and I get it. But the undocumented or unassessed emotional harm. I would argue that that's not necessarily a safety threat, depending on the severity of the child's response. Right? Go ahead, Martha.
So how do you, what you just said at the end of your sentence was softening it so that it was unclear. How do you make that judgment?
I would get a professional assessment done, or ask the kid's therapist so that you have that, here's that long-term, here are the potential safety risks. I would argue that that's more of a case planning issue and not a safety issue. Right? So maybe they need some better therapy, or that parent-child interactive therapy, kind of maybe the visits need to happen in kind of a therapeutic setting so that we can talk about that a little bit more and go from there. But I would be, if I were going to make the case that this were a safety threat, I would want to get that verified by a medical professional or a therapist to say that. And bring that documentation, not just the foster parent's word or their experience, but put that in front of a medical professional and say, what are the is this a safety risk or is this a long-term risk? Kind of putting it in those contexts.
Thank you.
Skylar.
So if you witness emotional abuse, is that a safety risk?
You'd have to be a little bit more specific about that, Skylar. What do you mean when you say emotional abuse?
Well, that's really the category here that we're talking about, emotional harm, right? I mean, if the parent is, battering the child verbally, then that's emotional abuse, right?
Yeah, you could make that case, and it's a safety threat because, yes. But I would encourage you to use the analysis. So what's the threat? How is the child vulnerable to that threat? And why can't the parent keep the kids safe from that threat? What's missing? And are there ways that we can mitigate that?
I'm just kind of going back to the idea that emotional abuse is as painful as physical abuse. If we saw the parent pounding on their kid in front of us, slapping the kid around, we'd intervene. So it seems like we should also intervene if there's emotional abuse.
It depends on the impact of that, Skylar. And I think that's the hard piece that's a little bit more, it's difficult to measure the impact. It doesn't leave bruises necessarily. Right? Kind of like there's a difference to some between a swat on the butt versus a paddling. And it's that fine-tuned, like, where are we with that? Like, how are we assessing what the actual damage is? And not making that be an assumption. And getting really clear about what the threat is.
Okay, well, I like the idea of, getting a professional involved to get a real assessment, but I'm still thinking if you see blatant abuse, whether it be physical, verbal, emotional, whatever, that's a risk.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, I hate to categorically say one way or the other. There's so many shades of gray in there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have to be careful because I'm the teacher, and then people will call me into court. So, you know what I'm saying? So I want to give you, like, here's the parameters here. But that undocumented or unassessed emotional harm, that's the biggest piece. And that's why I call it undocumented or unassessed. Because sometimes, and you guys know this too, you've been around the block, you get foster parents that are annoyed about how the kids are behaving after the visits. Because visits are an emotional time for kids, right? And so they get spun up, they're hard to control. And then you get the foster parents calling and saying, we've got to stop these, they're hurting the child. No, the child's having a normal response. What the child needs from you, caregiver, is helping to organize their feelings about that, what just happened. That's called caregiving. All right, let's keep going through this list. Chronic neglect is not a safety threat. How is chronic neglect? Somebody challenge me on this one. Is chronic neglect a safety threat?
No, it's not observable specific.
How do you chronically neglect somebody in 2 hours, right? Like, you can neglect them, but you can't chronically neglect them. That's not a reason for not doing a visit, especially supervised or even monitored, right? Or even time specific. You can't chronically neglect somebody in a time specific time. Oh, here we go. Cranky kids after a visit, not a safety threat. It's annoying, but it's not a safety threat. Lack of parent-child interaction. Again, it's not going to, that lack. So if the parent just comes in, plops their butt down and starts watching TV, it's not a safety threat. It may be a case planning issue, but not safety. Lack of sobriety. I'm being very intentional about the use of the word sobriety. It is very possible, and in fact encouraged, for parents to visit their children or children to have visits with their parents, even though the parents may not be completely sober yet. If we were to wait and allow visits only after parents have completed their 12 steps, these poor kids would never see their parents. Especially for older kids that have been in the home for a while, they're totally used to their parents being drunk, high. Like, that's where that vulnerability piece comes in as well, right? Similarly, incomplete services, not a safety threat. Incomplete services are case planning issues, but they're not a reason for why a child should be denied access to their parent. The unknown. Not a safety threat. Hospitals send kids home to parents that they don't know very well all the time. Do you remember when we were talking about that emotional capacity component? That's where this one comes into play. Does the parent want to keep a child safe that is entrusted to their care, whether or not they're blood or not. So a lot of times we'll get this with, we don't know about this dad. We don't know about dad's ability to parent. It kind of goes into the bottom one here too. A lot of people have children who have no idea how to parent, and their kids turn out okay. It's kind of one of those things you learn as you go, and that's okay. What we have here are case planning issues. And one of the big mistakes that we make is confusing safety issues with case planning issues. And when we try to fit case planning issues into that very narrow box that is case or safety planning, that's where our credibility starts to get undermined. Questions? Fishing. Safety planning is just preventing those events at the surface level. It does not get down into the deeper issues. And that's where we are. So,
Ryan?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Liz. I have a question about visits that specifically in one of my cases, they've gone from supervised to monitored to now basically unmonitored. Okay. And yet there's still safety questions in my mind about these visits. And the judge was quite clear that the law said that, the least restrictive environment for visits. And so just yesterday, she changed those parameters to be, basically unmonitored. How do I,
Liz,
how do I feel okay?
Yeah, let's do the analysis through this. Do you guys, okay. Is that okay with everyone? Like, let's use this worksheet and figure this stuff out. And here's the thing that I found when using this worksheet. Let's start with what we know, right? And so sometimes you don't know what the threat is. You just have this feeling that the kid's vulnerable. So Liz, tell us about your case. What do we got? What are we working with?
Okay, how much can I tell you? I don't know. Is it okay I will be as vague or as specific as I can. I have a 10-year-old child who's been, or almost 10, been in dependency for almost 5 years. Looking at the second termination of parental rights, she alleges, and the department had a founded finding of sexual abuse by mom's partner. Mom has since had 2 children with this partner. And mom requested longer visits. And throughout the whole case, it's been very clear that the partner cannot be present at her visits. And that has, the mom and her partner have abided by that. And so there's not, the reason why it was now monitored was to make sure that partner did not show up during visits. Mom also has 2 very young children, an untreated depression, and so has been found to, well, I guess that's a different subject. I don't know. But the untreated depression concerns me because the monitor has documented seeing mom asleep during visits, and the 10-year-old caring for the
3 and 1 year old. What else?
Does mom understand why her partner can't be present?
That's a really good question. Mom has never believed her daughter's allegations in 5 years. She has made excuses for it. And as recently as a month ago, just said, why can't we just get on with our lives? You know, she wants her daughter home. But yeah, mom denies the abuse, won't acknowledge it.
So what are your concerns?
Well, my concerns are if the visits aren't monitored, a couple things, like with mom's untreated depression, or she has claimed that she uses marijuana to treat her depression now, and that there's not going to be, you know, somebody checking in 20 to 30 minutes during the visits. I guess I have some concern that so visits just also went from 3 hours to 6 hours. And supposedly, you know, mom's partner is at work during those hours. But if there's no monitoring, you know, what if he's sick one day? What if he gets called off? What if, but I guess those are what ifs.
Yeah.
So my concern is that mom, and this is another part of it, mom's therapist has said that she is very concerned that the daughter will be the parentified child in the family. And I think that's been clear with reports from foster mom that the daughter has said, oh yeah, I change my brother's diapers all the time. And mom being asleep, granted, it happened once, you know, this past summer, but I don't know. So how do you know that a parent is being safe if it's not monitored?
What are I want to hear what the other thoughts are for the group.
Well, I think if the visits are unmonitored and the woman denies that the abuse happened, is she going to be diligent enough to follow that that the daughter is not around the partner? I would question that, because if she says it didn't happen, as far as she's concerned, there's no reason for him not to be there.
So that's a question for me too, Liz. Is there a safety plan?
That's a good question. I don't think we've done a safety plan in a long time.
So that's what you need.
Okay.
To talk to the department about. What's the safety plan? What do we do? So just those what ifs, right? That's what a safety plan covers. What if dad comes home early? How do we end the visit?
Good.
Or what if, you know, is dad aware of the schedule of the visiting so that even if he does get called off of work, he knows that he's not supposed to be there?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's talking about what those safety plans are to kind of cover some of those what ifs, right? And make sure that they both understand.
Okay. How old are the children again?
The daughter is almost 10, a couple weeks away from being 10. The younger ones are 3 and 15 months.
What about dad's capacity, or, you know, partner's capacity? Does he admit that he did anything wrong?
No, he doesn't.
Okay.
So what's to stop them from telling the daughter not to say anything? Say, well, don't tell him that dad's not here because he's not supposed to be here.
Yeah, there's nothing, I guess. She, you know, she has a great relationship. She's been in this foster family for a long time. And it seems like they have a very good relationship, the foster mom and the daughter. But I have been accused of being biased towards foster family because I use, you know, I have reported what foster mother has said, the daughter has said, and that nobody else, you know, it's unsubstantiated by any other fact, but it seems important to put the, you know, that she claims she changes diapers all the time. It seems like that's something that should be in my report if the therapist is saying she's worried about parentifying the child and all that.
So here's the other thing that helps with these two, Liz, and this goes for everyone. That's why you have different columns on this chart, right? Because what I hear you're doing too, and it's fine, but like you're bouncing around from different threats.
Yeah.
And so what you need to do is like fill out the column for the first threat, then move on and fill out the column for the second threat instead of bouncing around. Because what you're doing is you're stacking the threats and answering one threat with another threat. And it's common. That's what we all do, right? So pulling out those pieces. The other thing that I want to suggest too, this is a great example. Thank you for this. Really quickly, I just want to, here's another slide. So this is another thing that we're introducing with the new training as well. But having a piece in between unsupervised visits and monitored. And that new one that we're calling, and most of the people in the department know this, but it's that in the community. Right? So having the visit take place in a park or in a library or, you know, at a restaurant or something like that, where the community could potentially intervene. But it's that step between unsupervised and monitored.
That's really good.
To kind of introduce that as a concept as well. The other thing, when we're coming back into those, when we're talking about the threats, this is why I hate dependency. But when did the partner violate the child? Like, what were the circumstances around that?
She made the allegation when so she was found at 4.5, wasn't in any kind of schooling, and had a community member recommended Head Start. At Head Start, she was acting out in a hypersexual way. Social worker came in and interviewed her and said that she had a big secret, and the secret, blah, blah, blah. So that, and then she was removed from home quickly after that. So she had just turned 5.
Gotcha.
And so it's been almost 5 years.
And I'm assuming dad has gone through the psychosexual and all that.
Yes.
Has he been following?
And it's not bio dad. It's
partner.
That's okay. That's okay.
Has he been following the treatment recommendations for that?
Yes. And he was determined at the end of to be low to moderate risk of reoffense. And I think he did. He was quite young, and I think he has learned a lot, to give him credit for that. But
can I ask, what is the current pathway? Is it return home?
No, we are in the process of our second TPR.
Well, I know you can be in the process and still be like a path to be returning home.
The department is recommending termination. We had an FCAP. I don't know if you guys know about FCAP, but FCAP did recommended termination also, or not return.
So is it adoption and secondary return home is what I'm asking. Like, is it there a return home route at all?
Return home is not in any of it.
Okay.
It's adoption. I mean, I don't know if there's any answer anywhere, but I really do like the in-community supervision level.
Right.
That would make me feel much more comfortable.
And then maybe the other thing that you could do too, this is the other way, is maybe have one of the visits be some kind of therapeutic visit.
Oh, that's been discussed.
Right. But that be the only level of visit too. But
right.
But I guess if the thing is not, if the kid's not going to go home.
Well, we don't, as was made quite clear in court yesterday, we don't know that because we haven't had the trial yet.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have a therapeutic session when mom doesn't admit that it happened.
Is mom in therapy?
So 6 months ago, the department got a therapist for mom and partner to learn about the impact of everything, including the abuse that is had on mom's daughter. And as the therapist told me, mom's making very slow progress towards being able to recognize that, or being able to admit that something happened. But, you know, the accusations happened and she ended up having 2 children with him. She's, you know.
God bless America.
God bless America.
All right.
Yeah. I appreciate everybody hearing me spew. So thank you.
No problem. But like I said, use that and just, you need to ask the department for a safety plan. If dad should happen to come home, start there, go with that, see if he ever violates that.
Yep.
And if you're really concerned, I mean, you could do a no contact order.
Yeah. I did put, when mom made a motion to have longer visits, I responded to that motion with an objection to it. And,
sure,
you know,
mom can have all the visits she wants. You just can't do it with the partner.
Oh yeah, no, that is very clear in the order that partner cannot be present.
I don't know. I would still consider maybe thinking about a no contact order just to make that abundantly clear.
Right. Okay.
Yay. All right. Is that you got enough there, Liz?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you guys very much, everybody.
Thanks, does anybody have another one that they want to put out to the group?
I don't, but I would suggest Liz finding out what the alternative plan is, because if visits are going up, it sounds like the alternative plan is a return home. So I think the bigger question would be, I would, as a advocate, I would want to see what visits look like in the home, in the sense of terminate, like the judge ultimately makes the decision. So if the plan could be returned home and the termination doesn't go through, unfortunately, we do put kids in those situations where I feel like we sometimes re-traumatize them.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel that if we don't know what it's going to look like, and all of a sudden, like you said, they don't tell us that dad's around, sometimes that 10-year-old does slip up and tell us the big secret. But if we never give that chance, because that's what I think has been happening for years, is everything's been staying supervised. And then all of a sudden we just send a kid home, and then all these crazy things that we didn't know start popping up. So that's kind of where I think why it is important for us to start looking at it unsupervised. But I do feel like it's re-traumatizing the kid. But I feel like if a judge is authorizing longer visits, I would really look at seeing what's the secondary plan, because it doesn't sound like it's adoption solely if we're moving up in the visitation length. And it sounds like although her services aren't progressing enough for the termination track to stop, it's going. So, and that's generally like, you know, until her rights are terminated, she still has a fighting chance.
Right,
So.
right. No, thank you, Leah. I appreciate that.
You know, Liz, the flip side of that too is this is just something to consider, but how are we going to do overnights?
Haha.
No, I'm serious.
I know.
Like, what's the plan for overnights? And start actually asking that question.
Yeah. Right.
Because if the judge is going to go from 6 to 8 hours, the next thing is going to be, what do we do? So I would actually put that to the judge and be like, okay, well, why stop here, judge? Why don't we go to overnights?
Yeah.
And be kind of a jerk about it, but to kind of draw, like, this makes no sense, this plan that you're putting in for place, and watch the judge then have to backtrack from that. Because you're going to reach the point, that's where I'm talking about cranking up the pressure of parenting. Yeah. Get it to that point where it becomes unfeasible, but still safe.
Right.
Because otherwise we're going to be doing this for the rest of this kid's life.
Right. Well, and I don't know why this just occurred to me, but I could just do an unannounced visit during a visit. Oh,
make sure you check with your coordinator before you do that. And yes, you are not authorized to do unsupervised or unannounced visits unless you have the permission of your coordinator.
Oh, okay. Okay. I thought it was in my court order, but yes, I will check.
Still check with your coordinator, and just so that everybody knows that what's happening. I just want to keep you safe.
Thank you.
All right. Guess we weren't done with that one. Okay. Does anybody else have one that they want to ask the group for some help with? So I am highly encouraging you all to please start using this grid. I know, so here's the thing. I know this safety stuff seems really easy, right? Like, oh, electrical outlet, liquor shelf, got it. Totally understand the difference. Where pin hits, I don't know what expression I'm going to use, but where the pedal hits the pavement or whatever, is when you actually start to sit down and fill out this grid. Right? And start to be like, because what happens is you go through the process like, okay, well, why is this child vulnerable? Or what is the threat? Like, what am I looking for? Why am I concerned? And what this grid and what these boxes do is help you identify what your concern is and put it to the court in such a way that it's very easy to understand. And like you heard with Liz, right? Like sometimes you bounce around from one concern to the other and use one concern to bolster the other one. This way you've got that all in one spot, and it forces your thinking into why am I concerned, and gets you into that very specific, like, what's the problem here? Rather than just this vague, I have concerns, Your Honor. And again, talk to your coordinator about this, but I've heard of some places where they actually attach something like this to their reports, that 30-day report, where they're just, so that the court is very clear about what the analysis is. Because one of the problems with the department's analysis, sorry, Leah, and this is why the court actually was using a different framework. Let me see if I can find it here really quickly. Too many windows open. I will pop, oh no, this one. Yeah. Pop this in the chat for you all too. So the department has their own model, which is the 17 safety threats. Where did that go? I just had it. Oh, wrong window. And the problem that the court expresses with these particular safety threats, or the way that they're presented, open this window for you guys. Is that there's no analysis. It's just yes or no. So these 17 safety threats, the family, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's like the family or facility situation results in no adults in the home, facility performing parenting, childcare duties and responsibilities that ensure a child's safety. All the department has to do is answer yes or no. There's no analysis there. And oftentimes the analysis becomes, we saw it, right? The safety guide, so the framework that we were introducing before makes you go through what's the threat, why is that child vulnerable, why can't the parents keep the kids safe? It answers so many more of those questions, and it makes it that much clearer for the court to understand where you're coming from. You are essentially needing to provide the court evidence when you use that safety framework. And what the courts say repeatedly is, you're just giving me a worksheet where you checked off a box. I need more information. Which is why I don't like teaching about the 17 safety threats. It's not showing your work. And you guys can do better than that. What questions do you have about this? Or what else would you like to talk about? Anyone? Have I convinced you to use the safety threat analysis in your safety planning? Do we need to do more work there?
I have a question, Ryan.
Leah.
Yeah, advocate. Well, like these, I hear you say these are just the 17 threats, but there's questions for those threats that the social worker has to answer. There's 5 questions to break down the work that shows that the step-by-step answer. So when you say they don't show the work, now I'm not saying that every social worker does it correctly. I think that's a training issue. But I think it's hard for us as advocates and GALs because every 30 days, the department is working off of when we're talking about visitation, the judge and the department are using the safety threats that the department files, which is one of the 17. So in your thoughts, how do we advocate in the other way when we're kind of having to, you get what I'm saying? Like, that's where I think it gets confusing. I don't know if other counties does it different, but here in Pierce, like, we make our recommendations or we articulate our recommendations as well. But a lot of times the department always goes first. So then I think the judge utilizes that language. And then if I try to articulate in a different way, it always goes back to what the department stated in the first place, if that makes sense. So like and then the parents' attorneys articulate, we're all kind of articulating off of these 17 just because they are the ones who kind of start the conversation, if that makes sense. So it's like, I think her name was Julie, but in the chat, she put a question. She said, so if a social worker says that the safety risk is the parent has lack of knowledge, which I think is number 10 or something like that, and is not motivated, then how do you argue that back? So, and social workers do that all the time. And I don't know if Julie read the thing that they upload, but like, how do you think we should articulate that going against what they're, that language in the courtroom?
So that I would respond to that by saying, how is that? What's the threat? Just start there. Right? Respond and say, what is the threat? Go ahead, Leah.
Oh, no, I generally do. I'm just being plain, like, because I know it's easy for me to articulate, but I'm just speaking for other, because I've seen advocates struggle with that. Like, it's easy for me because I do know how to actually do the 5 steps to articulate. If like, so just using that one, number 10, caregivers like the parenting knowledge. An example of that would be like, I have a parent who has a 4-month-old who has a feeding tube, and she doesn't understand how to use it. We've set her up with several classes at the Seattle Children's, and she's canceled them all. So she has to stay supervised because she doesn't know how. So it's easy for me to articulate, but I have seen advocates struggle when the department says something. It's like, so like with me, I'm trying to learn both models, because like using that thing that we just broke down, the safety threat, and I use that to articulate. So I'm just playing devil's advocate. Like, they're going to throw that language out, but I know we still have to articulate. And that was just an example of how I would articulate. It is similar to the department, how she lacks the parent knowledge, but then I made sure to go observe, right? So I observed her not knowing what she was doing. I talked to medical providers. I made sure to document the appointments. Hey, she did it. So I'm just giving an example how to utilize both in the courtroom, because it is sometimes difficult when you only know one way, but yeah.
So here's the easy answer to that, Leah. Ignore the department's 17 safety threats model. And I know that's hard, but the court has been trained on the ABA safety framework. That's what they're used to seeing. Not, the department does not train the court on their 17 safety threats.
Yeah, and I agree with you, but our courts here in Pierce County use the same language as the department. So I get what you're saying, that they're trained, but they utilize the same terminology. So even when we're talking about case planning versus safety planning, how we're being taught is different than like a safety plan in the department world, So like, even when we're asking, so like sometimes I just pull up my form, like which language does the department use? Because when I'm requesting something, the department say, oh, I can't do that. But it's like, you can do that. I'm just saying it differently from you. So so it's like, for me, I just pull it up. Okay, what are they? Because sometimes I forget now because I get mixed up. But so I know when we're trying to advocate, sometimes I feel like there becomes a wall with the department, because it's like, we're not utilizing the language that they want us to use. So they're saying we can't do that. It's like, you can do that. You just call it something different.
So Leah, the answer to that is use the grid. I honestly, right? Because then the court's going to see that and be like, wow, I like this so much better. It's very clear what the problems are here. But if you just go in and say, that's not reinforcing that language, right? But if you use the grid and make sure you're very specific on that, eventually the court's going to be like, I like this analysis better, and I understand it. I understand how you got there. Versus the department's checking a few boxes. Sorry, I'm going to stick by that. But
Ryan, are you going to put the grid in the chat?
Oh, did I not do that? I will do that again.
Because in that situation, that is what the social worker answered was the safety threat, is what she came up with, was that the parent lacked the motivation to be a parent, and she lacked the knowledge on how to be a parent. That's what she cited as the safety threat.
But how is that putting the child in danger? That's the question. I don't know how to use a feeding tube. but that doesn't make me a threat. Why is that child in danger because of that? That's the piece that we need to answer. Other questions?
Ryan, can I make a statement?
Yes, fellow department worker.
I liked how you phrased that, because how is it the parent might not be able to put into the, you might not be able to know how to use the feeding tube, but how does that really make them a threat to their child?
Right.
I really liked how you phrased it because you looked at it differently. I understand where the department's coming from and how they have this concern of the lack of the parenting skill that the child has, but how does it really make it a threat?
How does that impact the parent's ability to parent?
Correct. And whether or not they can actually parent.
Keep the kids safe. So we've got case planning issues. Can the parent parent? Safety issues. Can the parent keep the kids safe while they're in their care?
That makes sense.
And it's kind of what comes back to Liz's question too, right? Like we can keep the kids safe. We can keep the kids safe by not allowing dad there. But the case planning issue is, or I'm sorry, partner there. But the case planning issue is, what are we going to do with partner? I'm going to offer myself up. If you ever get into a situation where you're struggling with a parent, or with a safety plan or issue like that, feel free to drop me an email and we can set up a time to kind of walk through that. And I'll go with it with your coordinators as well too, if this is something that you're really struggling with. But I was always the person, I've been doing all these trainings for a long time, right? And I'm like, oh, the safety stuff is easy. Like I got that all down. But then when I actually had to sit down and do a scenario where I used the grid, that's where I realized, oh, like that's where the power is, because you go and you'll be talking about it and then you'll change this over here. And you'll be like, well, and then I'm going to go back over here and say, this is what I think is the miss, until finally, after you balance all of those things and you fill out that whole grid, you're like, I get it now. And I know what the problem is. And that's what the court wants to hear from you. Not the generic, I have concerns. All right, I'm going to let you guys all go early because I feel like I could just beat I feel like at this point I'm just browbeating you into using the safety plan. But please try it out. Let me know how it works for you. If you've got suggestions about ways that we can modify it or make it different, or something where it's just you're stuck, by all means, give me a call or drop me an email. All right, everyone. Have a great afternoon and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Good night, Annette.
Feel loved.